COC-funded rapid rehousing or permanent supportive housing project in the Balance Estate, this webinar is for you. If you're not, you may find use from the HMIS stuff. In fact, I know that you will, but the remainder of the webinar may not be as applicable, but you're welcome to stick around and listen. Before we get started with that, the background for this, right? So in 2018, we've seen increasing emphasis on data. There's been a lot of pressure coming from the SNAP's office in DC on improvement of system performance measures. We're feeling that at the COC level. You guys are probably obviously feeling that at the project level. Thanks, Craig. You guys are obviously feeling that at the project level. So part of the goal of today is going to be to give you guys some of the tools that you will need to capture some of those critical data elements in HMIS to make sure that your reports are accurately reflecting the work that you're doing in your communities. In addition to that, we're going to look at the guidance that was released back in last October, CPD Notice 1711, which talks about calculating and administering utility assistance in the COC program. So we're going to look at how that impacts rent reasonableness, your rent reasonableness determinations, and the administration of utility assistance, and then how that plays into your participant rent calculations. The objectives of today, obviously, I want you guys to have a clear understanding of the workflow around the project start date. I know that this is a relatively new data element for PSH projects, and for rapid rehousing projects should have been using this data element, but we're going to talk a little bit more about making sure that you guys are doing that in a way, again, that reflects the work that you're doing in the communities. And again, we've already kind of gone over the objectives. Housekeeping items, right? So as of when I wrote this PowerPoint, we were still waiting on the COC NOFA. The NOFA was released yesterday at about 10 a.m. So at THN, we're going to be working hard over the next week or so to get you guys an RFP. We would encourage all interested agencies, if they're on this webinar, if they're in your community and you know someone who is thinking about applying for COC program funds, to review the 2017 application materials that are hosted on the THN website. That'll get you it's a great starting place. In addition, we sent out a constant contact email yesterday that talks about the actual 2018 NOFA itself and then the supporting documents that go along with it. There's some pretty cool bonus points available for DV providers. It's really interesting. This is going to be a cool year, I have a feeling. In addition, this webinar is going to be recorded and it will be hosted on our Balance Estate YouTube page after we're done. And I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Victoria to share her screen and talk a little bit about the HMIS workflows.
Okay, good morning everyone. I'm going to make sure that my screen is actually the right one. 1 second. Okay, there we go. Let me know if you guys have any trouble with audio, with hearing me, or with viewing my screen. This is just going to be a pretty straightforward demonstration. So Jim asked me to kind of walk through the concept of the housing move-in date in HMIS. So I've picked this training client, Black Bear. He is in our rapid rehousing program, our kind of dummy rapid rehousing program. And we see that they have a project start date of April 27th, 2017. But there's no housing move-in date here. So how would I go about entering that housing move-in date? That's a pretty straightforward process. You would click on the blue action button next to the enrollment, and you should see this menu option at the very top that says Edit Household Members Enrollment Information. When you click on that, let me just close this panel right here to give us a bit more room. When you click on that, it takes you directly to the HUD program enrollment page. Now, if you do intakes on a regular basis, this probably looks familiar to you, right? This is where you enter your client into a program. You select the program, you put the project start date, and so it takes you directly to this page. On the far right-hand side is a place where you can put the housing move-in date. It's kind of not very visible on my screen, maybe because of the kind of colors that I have my settings on for client track, but if you click in that row, it should highlight and you should have a space to directly type in that housing move-in date. Now, this is for a ESG rapid rehousing program, but if you are working with a permanent supportive housing program, this is kind of new, right? So what you'll probably see for some of your older enrollments, for the enrollments that were entered into the system prior to or before October 1st of 2017, what you might notice is that your project start date and your housing move-in date are the same, right? And that was kind of outlined by HUD. HUD gave vendors specific information about how to code that information on the back end. So you might see that if you have a very old enrollment, well, I say very old, but I suppose October 1st of 2017 isn't that old. But you might see that. So it's up to you then to go back and make that change. HUD says that it's okay if that's there, but I encourage you to go back and actually change the housing move-in date if it's not reflective of when they were actually, of when they actually spent their first night in your program. If you find that that date is indicative of them moving in, then you can leave that there. HUD says that's fine. But if you need to add it in, this is just the straightforward way to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and type in the move-in date. Let's see, I'm going to say, I went ahead and typed that in. You can, of course, actually, no, I want that to be 2017. You can click on the little calendar here and move the date this way if that is more convenient for you. I just prefer to type it in. Make sure that you save the page on the bottom right-hand corner. And once you make that change, you should see the housing move-in date on your client's dashboard. There's one more thing about this client that is kind of out of place. There's something missing with this client, and I'm going to give you guys maybe like 20 seconds to guess what else this client might need. Just based on their dashboard alone, what might they be missing, right? We're looking at their project start date, their housing move-in date. They don't have an exit date or a destination, and then we have last assessment completed over here. So based on that information, what might this client need? I don't know if any answers are coming in. I don't see anything popping up on my end. All right, well, if you haven't guessed, Jim mentioned it, so we're going to work through a client's annual assessment. So we can see on their last assessment completed column that their last assessment was actually when we enrolled them, 4/27/2017. So their annual assessment date has passed. And just to double check, you can open up your client's menu, you can check their assessments, and we can see that they only have that entry assessment here in their master assessments list. So they definitely need that annual assessment. How do I go about entering that information? Again, you're going to click on the blue action button, and then there is this menu option that says update/annual assessment. Well, we want to do an annual assessment. That's the menu option we're going to click. Again, it takes you to the HUD program enrollment page. You could, if you wanted to, update the housing move-in date this way. I don't really recommend that, but if you find yourself on this page, you can do it that way. I'm going to go ahead and save and move on, or click on No Changes. And then it asks what type of assessment do we need to complete. a during program enrollment, or an annual? Well, we already discussed this. Our client needs to fill out an annual assessment. Universal data assessment is the first page of that annual assessment. It's just asking about the client's health insurance. Has the client's health insurance status changed from their entry to this annual? And I'm just going to go ahead and default the last insurance status. That's going to pull what I put in the entry, which was no. I'm going to go ahead and save. Oops, what happened? Well, the assessment date is outside of the 60-day window of the annual assessment. And well, what does that mean, right? BlackBerry's anniversary date is 4/27. So I have to make sure that my annual assessment is set either 30 days before or 30 days after that 4/27 anniversary date. Let me know if that doesn't make sense and I can expound on that further. But essentially, you have a window, right, that you have to put in that annual assessment for. And my assessment date here clearly does not fit that window. So I'm going to go ahead and change it. Alrighty, let's go ahead and save that and move on. It'll ask about the client's barriers or special needs. My client does not have a disabling condition and that hasn't changed for their annual. I'm going to save and close. For income, I'm going to say my client does have income during their annual. They didn't when they first started the program, but now they do, and they don't have any non-cash benefits at this point. Save and close. Now, if you have any family members, you'll need to go through the same thing. Again, make sure that the annual assessment date falls within the specific window.
Victoria, I have a question. When you are doing those, when you're doing these annual assessments for the secondary family members, do the assessment dates need to match, or will that throw an error in the system if the assessment dates do not match?
That's a very good question. My gut reaction would be that we would prefer to see them match. If for any reason they do not, then you want to make sure that they still fall in that 60-day window. That is what the report is going to be looking for. If there is not an annual assessment within that 60-day window of their anniversary, the report is going to count them as missing that annual assessment. Now, for whatever reason, if you can't assess the clients on the same day, then you might see that you have different dates for the annual assessment. It should not trigger as an error so long as, again, it falls within that 60-day period. For convenience sake, you might think, yeah.
And just as another point of clarification, right? So the information that you guys are entering, if you are not able to, obviously we're doing this for Black Bear now outside that 60-day window. The information would need to be accurate as of the date that you're entering the assessment into HMIS. So, for example, if Black Bear got income, but he actually got income on May the 29th, that wouldn't have been accurate on 4/27. So that's just something else to consider as you guys are going through there. It's obviously best practice to, on the day that assessment is due, get in there and do it and just get it over with. But having to go back and backtrack can get a little complicated, especially if you've got multiple projects, multiple clients that all have annual assessments due at the same time, or competing interests in the office or what have you. So that's just something else I would want to add as far as data quality goes.
Yes, that's an excellent point. Thanks for adding that. And we're done. So we can see that our last assessment completed has changed. That date has updated. And if we look at their assessments, there is an annual assessment there in their master assessments list. There is one extra thing that I want to touch on. For the housing move-in date, actually. If you are doing any back data entry and you found that you're missing a housing move-in date for an enrollment that is already exited, you'll probably see that this edit household members enrollment information is not available to you. This menu option is only available for enrollments that are open, like this one. So if you have a closed enrollment and you need to add that housing move-in date, you can still enter that information. You would need instead to click this edit enrollment workflow. And what that does is it just basically takes you through the intake as you originally entered it. And you'd want to get to this program enrollment page, which is the same one that we saw with the other menu option. We just needed to click through a couple of extra pages to get here. Are there any questions about this? I do have a video on our YouTube channel that specifically covers the Edit Household Members Enrollment Information menu option for those that need it. So that is available.
It looks like Felicia has a question, so we're going back to the main chat. Can you put your question in the chat box, Felicia, and we will address that? Great. So thank you, Victoria, for that update. So yeah, that housing move-in date is going to be critical. We're going to be looking at housing move-in, the length of time that it takes for a project to identify a participant and get them into housing during the 2018 local COC competition. So I would encourage PSH projects that have not been doing housing move-in dates to review the tools on the HMIS website or the HMIS YouTube channel to go in there and put in those housing move-in dates. Again, we're going to put this up on the Balance of State YouTube channel, which is kind of bare right now, but I'm working on that. It may take a little while though, so if you need immediate video tutorials, you can always go to the HMIS YouTube channel. So Felicia says, what about annual assessments when people enter a month or more apart? Do you still do the assessment for the family at the same time? Victoria, do you want to talk about what the HMIS guidance is on that? So it sounds like, Felicia, you're talking about participants that maybe the head of household entered, and then at some point there was another family member that joined the household, and then when would that annual assessment need to happen for that additional family member? Okay, yeah, that's what I thought.
And I'm looking through the actual HUD data standards manual right now to see if there is anything specific about clients that may not come in together at the same time. I would think, based on what I am seeing in the HUD data standards, participating project. So, and this is on, if you guys ever pull up the 2017 HMIS data standards, I'm on page 64, on the bottom of page 64. What HUD says is that annual assessments are based solely on the head of household's anniversary date. The annual assessment must include updating both the head of household's record and any other family members at the same time. So earlier, I think I mentioned, that you might have it off by a couple of days, maybe, so long as it fell within that 30-day window. I was wrong, according to the HUD data standards. HUD data standards say that annual assessments are based solely on the head of household's anniversary date. So that client that came in a month afterwards, they would still be assessed annually based on their head of household's anniversary date, according to the HUD data standards.
Looks like we've got another question from Tammy about the assessment dates. So I think Tammy, it's important to consider, right? Like, is this participant still in your project, right? If you have access to this participant and you miss their annual assessment, the system will not allow you to enter a date that's outside that 60-day window, right? So you're going to have to get with that participant and talk to them about their situation, their financial situation during what it looked like during that 60-day window, right? The incentive for the project is to not miss the annual assessment because it becomes infinitely more complex if you do. But right, the system will not allow you to input an annual assessment for the household or for that participant if you miss that 90-day window. So you're going to have to go back in time to create that annual assessment. Now, obviously, if your participant is exited the project, and that's a whole other story, right? Like we're not asking projects to like contact clients that have already exited or anything like that. But right, if a participant is still in your project, then yeah, they need to have an annual assessment, assuming they've been in the project for 12 months.
All right, any other HMIS related questions? And if you think of any later on, please feel free to get in touch with us at hmis@thn.org. I think Craig might be typing that up right now. There you go. Email hmis@thn.org for any of your HMIS related questions, and we will certainly get you sorted.
It looks like we may have one from Connie and Texarkana. And then Michelle. Let's see what we got. So Connie asks, if they left the program at 6 months, you do not need an assessment. So that's correct. You do not need an annual assessment. You will still need to do an exit assessment that looks at their financial situation and their health insurance and disabling conditions, etc., when that participant exits the project, but you would not do an annual assessment on that participant.
Right, and that's the same for Michelle Wormley. If they have not been in the program for a year when it's time to submit your APR to SAGE, then no, you would not conduct an annual assessment. The annual assessment is only for clients that have been in your program for a year or longer.
And something that we didn't talk about is we didn't talk about using that update during program enrollment to capture changes during the program year prior to annual assessment. I mean, I think that that's generally a best practice. You can use the update during program enrollment assessment to capture increases in income or changes in income up or down during the participant's length of stay, even if they're not required to have an annual assessment yet. That way, right, whenever you go in to do the annual assessment, you're literally clicking default, and there will be no changes to the annual assessment because you'll have already gotten the most up-to-date information during program enrollment.
Right, and so that answers Michelle's question. If they're still in the program, what assessment do you conduct? Again, that would be that update during program enrollment. So if you think back to when we walked through the process of the annual assessment, we had those two options, right? During program enrollment or annual. If they haven't been there for a year, or if it's not their yearly anniversary, you wouldn't do the annual, you would instead do that during program enrollment. And essentially you see the exact same things as you would in the annual. It's just coded differently.
You're right. So Michelle. if you do an update to during program enrollment, and you don't do an annual assessment, all that work that you did for that update during program enrollment will not get pulled into the report when you run your APR. If you guys still have additional questions about annual assessments and how all the pieces of the system play together, please reach out to the HMIS desk. Feel free to CC me on that stuff, and we'll, like Victoria said, get you sorted out to make sure you have a good understanding about what your responsibilities are. Awesome. All right. Thank you so much, Victoria.
Thanks for having me.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
So the other part of today's webinar, we're going to talk about Notice CPD 1711. So Notice CPD 1711 was released on October 23rd of last year. It applies to all COC-funded permanent housing program types or project types. So that's permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing, transitional housing. Notice that we have no transitional housing in the balance of state, but we do have both permanent supportive housing and rapid rehousing. Further, right, there is a difference between rental assistance component type permanent supportive housing and leasing component type permanent supportive housing. There are different rules that apply to both. So this notice actually clarifies the procedures for calculating utility allowances for all of those project types. It also clarifies how utility reimbursements are made, what documentation must be maintained by the project, and which budget line items may be used to pay utility reimbursements. So as we're having this conversation today, there are some kind of distinctions that we need to make in terms of definitions. So when we're talking about participants today, we're talking about the household enrolled in the COC project, whether that's an individual or multiple individuals. So if it's 5 adults and 7 kids or 1 adult, as long as they're, if they're enrolled in the project as a household, they are, for today's conversation, going to be a participant. In addition, right, what I call a utility allowance, HUD in the notice calls a reasonable monthly utility consumption amount. That's a mouthful, so I like to just call it a utility allowance. The utility allowance is the amount of utility assistance that the household is eligible for. This amount is determined by the COC project. It is also used when the COC project is determining rent reasonableness and a participant rent portion, or if you're a leasing project, when you're determining a participant's occupancy charge. A utility reimbursement is the payment that is made by the project to pay the utility allowance, whether that payment is made to the utility company itself or to the project participant, and we're going to dig into all of that. The notice itself is in the file box, and I believe it is titled Notice CPD-17-11, right? So it's I want to say it's an 8-page, or it might be a 10-page document. I think it's a 10-page document that is broken down into sections like most other HUD docs, but it literally goes over the purpose of the notice, the background, and then quickly kind of dives into how you calculate a participant's rent contribution or occupancy charge. So I think it's important to consider, right, like why did they have to release this notice? The existing regulation or the COC program interim rule did not address how utility assistance was to be provided when a participant has zero income or they are not required to make a rent contribution on their own behalf. So previously to this notice, right, there was no answer for how a project was supposed to administer that utility assistance. Essentially what this notice does, and Cliff Notes version, right, is break down the ways that you guys are going to be calculating and paying out that utility assistance. So it matters, right, like which project type your participant is in. So if you're a COC funded permanent supportive housing project that receives rental assistance for your housing component, you'll do it a certain way. If you're a project type that does it, that you're a leasing permanent supportive housing project and you impose occupancy charges on your participants, you'll do it another way. I wanted to just show you guys this notice here and make sure that everyone that is operating a project of this type has the opportunity to download this notice. You're going to want to refer back to it. It talks about, right, the documentation that you have to maintain. But we're going to go over all of that today. We're not going to be looking at this notice a whole lot. We may refer back to it from time to time. This also applies to rapid rehousing in the balance of state. So the HUD COC program interim rule says that COCs are in charge of determining how participant rent portions are determined in rapid rehousing. So the Texas Balance of State COC actually refers, essentially the rent portions are calculated the same way that they're calculated for permanent supportive housing. So all of the information in here applies to rapid rehousing. All of the information that we're going to talk about today applies to rapid rehousing. The same for PSH rental assistance. So, right, like when you're reviewing this notice later on, Michelle, you may see the part about rapid rehousing. And let me find that real quick. It talks about a COC may design rapid rehousing rental assistance so that each program participant pays a fixed portion of their income towards rent. Each program participant pays a rent contribution based on an incremental sliding scale. We use the first bullet point in the Texas Balance of State today on June 21st, 2018. Now, I would encourage anyone that's operating a rapid rehousing project in the state of Texas or in the balance of state to pay attention to the constant contact emails going out. I know that revising that written standards for rapid rehousing rental assistance is something that's on the radar. Obviously, with the release of the NOFA, that's probably not going to happen in the next 90 days. But right, like we have been talking about this idea of progressive engagement and how you guys are able to kind of create these tiers, participant rent portions, etc. So what we're talking about today is applying to the way that the Texas Balance of State written standards are currently written. That's a great point of clarification that I'm glad Michelle asked about rapid rehousing. So again, we may refer back to this document during the presentation, but we probably won't be looking at it a ton. What we will be looking at, right, is how you guys are going to determine that utility reimbursement. So the notice states that projects should use the utility allowance schedule that is maintained by your local public housing authority. So again, another good reason for projects to have a relationship with their PHAs, but that's up to the project to contact their local housing authority and obtain that utility allowance schedule. This is not news to them. You can provide them with a copy of this notice that says that you have to use it if you get any pushback about them releasing it to you. I haven't heard about anything like that, but you never know, right? So depending on who you talk to, if they don't know what you're talking about, you can definitely get this document. So if you're already using this document, great. Everyone should already be using this document, but you would be surprised when, and also, right, if there's new projects, this isn't something that your HUD rep is necessarily going to go over with you during your C19A or anything like that. So the schedule is generally released or updated annually, and a new schedule is released on October 1st, not always. Projects should maintain evidence of due diligence and ensuring that the most up-to-date schedule is being used, right? So the schedule that would be in effect right now would be a schedule that was released on or around October 1st, 2017, or to go into effect 2017. And right, there will be releasing another one in the fall for the 2018-2019 year. Another thing that's really important to do while you guys are, determining the utility reimbursement and the utility allowance is to have someone to double check the math. I think that's really important, making sure that all the boxes are filled out on the form, that the participant or the household participant name on the form matches the supporting documentation that you're using to create that utility allowance. When your HUD rep comes out to monitor, or if THN comes to do like just on-site technical assistance, there should be no missing dates or empty signature boxes on your utilities schedule or any of the other documents that we're talking about today. But that's definitely a way to raise red flags if you are using a utility schedule that is either outdated and there's no supporting documentation, or your utility allowance worksheets are not complete all the way. So what am I talking about when we're talking about the utility allowance worksheets. I think that the utility allowance worksheet is, again, something that you get from your PHA. I actually reached out to Giving Hope last week to get a copy of theirs because they're surprisingly hard to find online. But you'll notice that they're all going to look roughly similar, right? They're all going to have the same kind of format that breaks the utility assistance down by unit size. But further, they're going to break down that utility assistance by unit type. So apartments are going to be considered multifamily. There will be another one for SFAs or for SFH for single family homes or for mobile homes. Just ensure that when you're calculating utility assistance or using these schedules that you're using the correct one for the type of housing that your participant is proposing to occupy or that is already occupying. You'll notice that on this particular utility schedule, there's nowhere or there are no reimbursements for bottle gas, and I believe that's because of the housing type, or maybe that there are no units using bottle gas in Denton, Texas. I don't know. You may have information on the schedule that you get from your PHA, but it's up to you again to make sure that you're using the correct line when you're calculating this utility assistance. So where do you get this information from? I'm going to show you guys a sample lease doc that I created for myself that will show you specifically on a standard TAA lease where this information exists, right? So on number 7 of a standard TAA lease, it indicates which utilities and services that the landlord will pay for. So in this particular hypothetical situation, the landlord's paying for gas, water, wastewater, not paying for electricity, but paying for trash and recycling and stormwater. For the purposes of this notice and for the purposes of calculating utility assistance, cable and satellite are not utilities. Master antenna, I don't even know what that is, but it's not a utility. Internet, it's not a utility in the eyes of the Department of Housing and Urban Development. So that's just something to consider as you're going through here to make these determinations. But you'll notice again, right, like the only utility that this participant would be required to pay, it appears from the lease, is electricity. The other thing on the TAA noted, or the TAA lease, that I wanted to draw your attention to is this section 9, special provisions. Sometimes landlords like to put, what do they call those? Non-metered charges, right? So like if everyone's on a boiler and they put, they charge all the participants for gas based on an allocation. There are specific ways by state law that they have to do that, but they may put that type of information here in special provisions. The last thing that I wanted to draw your attention to is, and I don't know why this is upside down, so I apologize, but I think you guys can bear with me for just a second. I think that's because of the way this document was scanned. So this says the lease will control if there is a conflict with the summary. So the last page of a standard TA lease is a summary, but if there's a conflict between what box 7 says and what the summary says, what box 7 says wins. So just make sure that you guys are checking the entirety of the lease, especially as you're accompanying participants to sign their leases. You want to make sure that all this stuff jives. It's in the best interest of the landlord as well, right? Like they want to make sure that it all matches because it opens them up for liability later on down the road. But, the point of this conversation right now is to determine which utilities we'll use to calculate the assistance. So I'm going to stop sharing that. I wish I could share both of these at the same time, but I can't. So you'll notice, right, that for this multifamily unit, electricity for heating, the participant would get $6. If the participant uses electricity for cooking, they get, I can't read that, I think that's $3. The other thing, right, is that like that's that's great. Like you're using the lease to determine which utilities the resident is responsible for, but like if you go into the resident's apartment and they have a gas stove, but they're not required to pay for the natural gas in their unit, then they would get neither a natural gas or an electricity credit for cooking. I just want to make that point, that clarification, right? So like there are additional, you get, it's a little bit of legwork, right? So to figure this part out. But generally, other electricity like lights, appliances are all going to be a general, everyone would get that credit as long as they're responsible for paying for their electricity. Air conditioning, the same. If they have an electric hot water heater, the same. Now you'll notice that on this particular unit, the landlord pays for water, sewer, trash. So this participant would get none of those credits, right? The other thing that I see sometimes whenever I'm reviewing people's utility schedules that are completed is folks getting credit for microwaves and refrigerators. So if your participant rented a unit that came with a stove, they do not get a $10 credit for installing a microwave in the unit. If your participant rented a unit that came with neither a stove or a microwave, then they would get a $10 monthly credit for installing one of those items in the unit. I know that sounds crazy, but apparently by Texas law, landlords can lease units to people without stoves and without refrigerators. The same thing applies to refrigerators. So if the only way that your participant should be getting a credit for either one of those things is if they literally purchased and installed that into the unit. I would highly encourage you to think critically about leasing or encouraging your participant to lease a unit that doesn't come with the stove or refrigerator. But apparently it happens. I've never seen that in the decade I've been doing this. The other thing, right, are these service fees. So if your participant is responsible for electricity, they would get an $8 service fee. The next step would be to, again, actually the first step should have been, sorry guys, completing the family allowance section. So the name of the family, the address of the unit, and then transposing each of these items from the top of the document down to the bottom and getting a calculation, a total calculation for the household or for the participant. Does all that make sense so far? I saw Taisha was typing in the box. Are we all together right now? Right, yeah, that's fair. Yeah, so for the purposes of this slide, right, like they would get credit for that $8 utility electric fee. That's okay. No, that's fair. Like this is really, it's complex to talk about, I feel like, and it's complex to explain to other people. So if you guys have questions, this is what this webinar is. That's literally why we're here today. So where is the service fee box located? It may be different in your PHA. Your PHA may not give allowances for service fees, but typically on a utility bill, there will be something like a monthly service fee or a customer service charge. They may not call it a monthly electric fee or monthly gas fee on the utility bill. But again, that was something that would have to be, a part of the utilities. So Susan asked, do we use a form like above? Yes. So this is a copy of the Denton Housing Authority's utility assistance schedule. So every COC project in the state or in the balance of state should contact their local PHA to receive their own schedule like this. It's going to be different in every town. these dollar amounts in Denton are not going to be the same as Laredo, or not going to be the same as Corpus, or what have you. So, right, so it says, does it matter what is on the bill? I thought we only use this form. I mean, my understanding, right, is if like your participant's not paying it, they shouldn't get an allowance for it. Does that make sense, Taisha? I have the amounts for each county that we service, but I have not seen this form. So, right, so again, Susan, this form is coming from the Public Housing Authority in Denton. Yours may look a little bit different, but, and I'm totally drawing a blank on where safety is right now. But you should be, right, so Mount Pleasant, you may be using the Longview Public Housing Authority utility schedule, which may look a little bit different from the Denton Housing Authority's utility schedule, but they should have something very similar to this. I see a lot of questions. This is good. I'm saying, okay, so Michelle, so if the unit is furnished with a stove and a fridge, you would not calculate an allowance for range and microwave or refrigerator. They would still get a cooking allowance, assuming, right, that their refrigerator and stove, in this example, were operated with electricity. And Taisha, it looks like for your question, this fee must be given to all participants that pay electricity, gas, or both. So in Denton, they're saying that everyone is getting this utility assistance, the monthly electric fee. So Michelle, right, does that make sense? Okay. Elena, I have not had a lease signed where the water bill is billed to the tenant, but they pay it with their rent. So, if they're paying a water bill, then they should be getting an allowance for water. If they're paying sewer, now, if they're, right, so water sharing, I don't think that the notice actually clarifies when they're like non-metered utilities. I would default to how your public housing authority uses this form, right? So if your public housing authority is giving people water allowances in that situation, then you should as well. The key here, right, is to just not go like blazing saddles into the Wild West and just start circling things that don't apply to your participants, right? So I think that that's probably a good first step. If you don't get clarification on that, reach out and I'll get you something from the SNAP's office. But the notice does not clarify if they're sub or allocated, sub-metered or allocated. Looks like Catherine's got a question, so we're going to hang on this slide for just a second. Oh, Catherine. I don't have a great answer for you on that. The notice doesn't clarify. Right. Would we calculate the total allowance and split it in half? I would be really surprised if there is a FAQ for how to do that. We're going to have to chat offline about how to do it when there's a roommate situation. Right, but like so for example, if there are two participants that are in your project that are occupying the same unit, they would not each get a utility allowance equal to the entire amount of the utilities. I would be curious how your PHA is handling roommate situations, if they're doing it at all. Let's chat about that offline. Right now, for the purposes of this webinar, we're assuming, again, right, that the participant is the only person occupying the unit or the only household occupying the unit. Oh, if they're both on one lease, then they would be paying one rent amount. Let's talk about this offline. Okay. All right. So what do you do after you've gone through the hand wringing and hair pulling of determining a participant's utility assistance or utility allowance? What do you do with that number? Well, ideally, you would put it down here in the total box so that whenever someone else comes to look at this document, they'll know how much you're proposing to provide in utility allowance. But you'll take that number, right, and coming back to this PowerPoint, because I just want to make sure I'm staying on track here. You'll use it to determine rent reasonableness, and then you'll use it to determine a participant's rent contribution or occupancy charge. So using it to determine rent reasonableness, right? Like this one is one that trips up a lot of people. But when you are making rent reasonableness determinations, projects should be comparing the gross rent of the proposed unit to comparable units in the neighborhood. So that means that you're comparing the contract rent plus any applicable utility allowance to get a gross rent. Let's take a look at the utility assistance, or I'm sorry, the rent reasonableness checklist. And I think that is gonna be here. This is a pretty standard rent reasonableness checklist. It is available in a Word doc where you guys can fill your agency name, all that good stuff in. But you'll notice, right, there's a number of boxes that you need to fill in for the proposed unit, and then boxes that you would fill in for the comparable units that you're using to make this rent reasonableness determination. This can be a time-consuming process. It can be a relatively easy process. It kind of depends on how you go about it. HUD actually published a document titled Rent Reasonableness and FMR in the CoC program, right? So all projects are required to make a rent reasonableness determination. So your award was based on FMR at the time that you submitted the application for this project, the operating year that you're in right now. So that FMR may be old at this point, right? It may be 2 years old. And depending on your community, right, like Odessa, I know, for example, is experiencing a huge increase in rent amounts in a very short period of time. So that FMR may not equal or maybe less than what you determine to be reasonable when comparing units to other units in your community, right? So all projects can go up to FMR using CoC program funds. Rental assistance, both PSH and rapid rehousing, can go above FMR using CoC program rental assistance dollars, right? So what that means is if you determine that a unit is reasonable in relation to other units, you really don't have to consult FMR if you're a rental assistance project. as long as that unit's reasonable and you've met all the other kind of statutory compliance things like housing quality standards, all that good stuff, lead-based paint, you should be able to move forward with that, right? However, if you're a leasing project, you are not allowed to go over FMR for any unit using CoC program leasing funds. So if you determine that a unit is reasonable but it's above FMR, you're going to have to find some alternate funding to make that work, right? So that could be discretionary funds. You could do a fundraiser annually to get extra, funds to offset those costs of the increases in rent, in your community that aren't reflected in the FMR. So I think when you guys are working, especially for rental assistance projects, as you're determining this rent reasonableness, you're going to want to make sure that you're considering FMR in the background of your mind, right? Like, because again, that's the basis for your awards. So if you're consistently exceeding FMR as you're providing rental assistance to participants, you could run out of funds before you've served the contracted number of participants. It happens occasionally. More often we see people leaving money on the table because they're not considering participant occupancy charges, but it's important to consider FMR. For leasing projects, it is paramount to consider FMR as you're determining rent reasonableness. So why am I talking about this right now? Because you're going to use that utility allowance here on the rent reasonableness checklist where you're making that determination to determine whether or not the proposed unit that you're looking at or that your participant is looking at is reasonable in comparison to other units in the community. Now, HUD has said that you must maintain documentation of the evidence used to make the rent reasonableness determination. I would highly encourage everyone on this webinar today to read this rent reasonableness and the CoC rent reasonableness and FMR in the Continuum of Care program. It's actually linked down here in the files, so it's downloadable. You can download it and read it at your leisure. It's not that long. It's only like 6 pages or 8 pages or so. But right, it talks about the determining and documenting rent reasonableness right there on page 1, like how you can go about doing that, right? Like if your sorry, I just saw your question, Michelle. I'll get to it in just 1 second, right? So what you need to maintain with that rent reasonableness determination, right? So like it's not good enough to just have this form completed in its entirety in the file. Projects would need to also have printouts of the websites that they use to get the information to complete the comparable section. I like apartments.com. I've been using that one recently. I've just been kind of checking out communities around the state. It seems to be pretty inclusive. I will say that I was surprised, actually not really surprised at the lack of units in Mount Pleasant. But I think if you look at the Longview area and that area in general a little bit you kind of pan out, there are more units to compare with. But the reality is it's always going to be a challenge finding comparable units for smaller cities and smaller projects in general. But, you guys will need to maintain that evidence of the documentation that you use to make this determination, right? So Michelle says, how will the FMRs ever be valid if the grant awards are 1 to 2 years in the future? Right, so you can, you can use the current FMR when you should be using the current FMR when you're making rent reasonableness determinations specifically for leasing projects. That's not as relevant for rental assistance projects, but you're right. Like the awards are always going to be behind, and until the due date for the CoC program application is after October 1, on any given year, it's always going to be like that. I don't have any evidence that it's going to change. It's really, when you look at FMRs from year over year, they're really not that much of a difference. There has to be something significant happening in the community in order for there to be a significant difference in FMR. Like again, I go back to Odessa, they're experiencing, right, like that shale oil boom right now, and so they're, I think they added something like 31,000 oil jobs in the last 6 months or something from what I was reading. So there's a shortage of housing, and as a result, FMR is not reflective of what rent reasonableness is in that community. But by and large, it should be relatively close. Right. Yep. No, you're right. And the coast and Corpus and Victoria, Galveston, and a lot of places will have experiences that will move reasonableness from FMR, and that's okay if you're a rental assistance project to pay over FMR. You just need to be aware of the basis for your award and how all that ties back together. Right? I mean, like generally you will have enough money to account for those increases in rent reasonableness, especially if participants are paying a portion of their income in rent to the landlord. So I guess all this is to say, right, like this is what, when you are determining a participant's utility allowance, you will use it for more than just determining their rent portion or that utility allowance itself. So something else to be aware of. Yeah, no, you guys definitely. Hurricane Harvey was devastating, and I know that the coast right now I think is getting a lot of rain. So those folks that are on the coast and are on this webinar, I appreciate you guys taking the time to pay attention to this with all the other competing interests. Okay, so calculating participants' rent. Actually, I want to go back to the PowerPoint for just a second. It's 11:36. This webinar is going to go until 12 o'clock. I want to make sure that we actually get everything right. So we talked about making that rent reasonableness determination. You're going to compare the gross rent of the proposed unit to the gross rent of the comparable units to get that determination basis. You're going to maintain all of that documentation in the file. You're also going to use the allowance or reimbursement when you're determining a participant's rent portion. So in general, rent contributions are not to exceed 30% of the adjusted gross income of the individual or household. And rent calculations are to be conducted as outlined in the interim rule for your project type. Rent calculations must consider the utility allowance if the participant is entitled to one. And where the utility allowance is greater than the rent portion or occupancy charge, the participant is entitled to utility reimbursement. So when it says that they must be conducted as outlined in the interim rule for your project type, that essentially means they need to be done every 12 months or when a participant reports a change in their income. So we talked about some of the key considerations for determining rent reasonableness. That document's a great resource. Apartments.com is a good resource for obtaining comparisons. Again, just like the utility schedule, making sure that checklist is complete. You have to have a determination that supports the project's actions, i.e. you must have a determination that supports reasonability if you're using CoC program funds on a unit. We talked about FMR. All right, so rent portions, right? So for rental assistance projects, for both rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing rental assistance projects, you're required to calculate a participant's rent portion. Even if someone has zero income, they should still have a rent calculation done that reflects that zero portion. If a participant has zero income, they must not be required to pay rent. I will repeat that. If they have zero income, a CoC program cannot require them to pay rent in the balance of state. but they should have a calculation that documents their utility reimbursement if that's applicable and if they are owed a utility reimbursement. So what that means, right, is you might have somebody without income who is in a unit where they're responsible for utilities. And that rent calculation should document how you guys are accounting for that utility allowance or that utility, which would then become a utility reimbursement. Right? Because if a participant has a rent portion that is less than 0, they must be given a utility reimbursement equal to the difference between that negative number and 0. And we're going to go over the rent calculator here in just a second. But again, like rent calculations should be done no less than annually. Or any time a participant reports an increase in annual income of more than $250, or any time a decrease in income is reported. All rent calculations should be accompanied by the documentation that was used to make that determination, right? So if your participant is on SSI and you're doing a rent calculation in 2018, you should have a 2018 award letter used to back up that rent calculation. If your participant is employed, you should have pay stubs that back up that rent calculation, right? It's not necessary to collect 12 months of pay stubs. You can annualize a participant's income based on check stubs. If you have additional questions about how to do that, we can talk about it offline. And Susan is asking, are you saying that everyone should have income before they're housed? I'm saying the opposite of that, actually. We want you guys to house as many people as you possibly can without income, because those are the folks that are generally the most vulnerable. Obviously, that's dependent on your community's coordinated entry policies and procedures, but generally what we see is the folks that are hired on the vulnerability list are generally those folks that have no resources. So those kind of go hand in hand. What I'm saying instead, Susan, is that if you enroll people without income, you cannot require them to pay rent until they get income. And additionally, right, like a rent calculation should be accompanied by documentation to make that determination, right? So if they have 0 income, they should be accompanied by a 0 income certification. If they have SSI, they should be accompanied by a current SSI award letter, et cetera, et cetera. That's for rental assistance, right? For rental assistance, both rapid rehousing and leasing project, or I'm sorry, rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing projects. For leasing projects, it's a little bit different, right? Leasing projects are not required to impose an occupancy charge as a condition of residing in the project. However, if they do, they may not exceed the highest of 30%, 10%, or public agency welfare, which we don't really have in Texas that I'm aware of. Again, the same applies if you have a participant and their occupancy charge calculation returns a number less than 0, they should be given a utility reimbursement. Again, they should be done no less than annually, and all occupancy charge calculations should be accompanied by documentation. So let's take a look at the rent calculator that's hosted on the THN website. So whoa, I'm going to have to share my screen again, guys. Hang on just a second. I can't share Excel spreadsheets on Adobe Connect, but I can share my screen. So this is the CoC funded project rent calculator that, or occupancy charge calculator. It will work for both project types. It'll work right now. It'll work for any project type in the balance of state. If you're a CoC funded rapid rehousing or permanent supportive housing. If the written standards are revised and rapid rehousing changes, then that will no longer be accurate. But as of right now, today, June 21st, 2018, you could use this rent calculator on anyone that's participating in a project in the balance of state that's CoC program funded. I can't emphasize that enough. I can't speak to the applicability of ESG or TVC or any of the other funders that exist in the balance of state, but I know that for CoC funded projects this will work. So, right, like you can get this document from the THN website under the Continuum of Care page. You can enter and should be entering your participant's name, the address of the unit that they live in, who prepared this document. And then additionally, right, any adult household members that any adult household members, right? So the head of household would go under column C. You can put their name, their first name there. And then any wages, salaries. The only manual calculation that you guys will have to do is annualizing a participant's wages or salaries. So for example, if, let's just say, I forget that guy's name that Victoria was using. We'll just use me, Jim W. Let's just say a little bit 123 Congress. And this was prepared by Jaime Arispe, because I'm in the West Care Next Step project. So, right, you would put my name here. And then you would put my annual wages and salaries. So let's say I am actually not working. Let's say I'm on Social Security and I'm receiving the minimum of $750 a month. So you would have to do a calculation of 750 times 12, which is $9,000. So you'd put that 9,000 in the box that correlates. And then you would do the same for any other household member, adult household member, in the columns to the right of that head of household box. I do see that we've got a question in the chat. I'll get back to that in just a second. Right, so if there are other household members, adult household members that have income, you would put their income in these boxes. But essentially what you get done when you get done entering all of those income sources is you'll get a household's total annual income, which is $9,000. If you'll also notice, right, if you have questions as your participants or your staff are going through this document, working on how to complete this or what would be considered income, right? Like there are tabs here about included income, things that are specifically and explicitly excluded from being considered income for the purposes of HUD rent calculations. But all that's there, right? So like I've never seen someone with net income from real estate or personal property. Your community may be different, but that box is there because HUD wants us to consider that. So, right, like if there are dependents under the age of 18 that live in the household, you would enter the number of dependents here. So let's say I've got 3 kids. So I would get, right, the worksheet auto-calculates this dependent allowance. So, right, I would get $1,440 for a dependent allowance. Let's say, so these get kind of technical, right? Like whether or not family, if I'm incurring a child care expense that it would enable me to work. So like if I had to pay a sitter to watch my toddler while I'm at work, I could claim some allowance there. What this worksheet will do is, make sure that you read these sections, right? So like, it couldn't just be like, I want to like go hang out and go to a baseball game. It would have to enable me to work in order for me to claim this allowance. But make sure you're reading these sections, and then it'll actually add these up a little bit further on in the worksheet. The same applies for disabled or handicapped assistance allowance, right? Like if there's a disabled family member, in order for a participant, in order to be able to claim some allowance here, the cost that they would have to pay would be enabling another family member to work, right? So like somebody's earnings would have to be dependent on the disabled assistance. Medical expenses, right? Like, pretty much anything that would be considered medically necessary would be considered a medical expense. So for example, if your household is on SSDI and they're having to pay Medicare premiums out of their check, so like let's say their gross amount's really $925 a month, you're going to have to make the rent calculation based on that $925, but then they would get a medical expense allowance because of the unreimbursed medical expense. So the thing to consider with that, right, is that like in order for any of these expenses to have any impact on their rent calculation, they need to be more than 3% of the gross annual income. So in this situation, right, like my gross annual income is $9,000. Any medical expenses or any of these other expenses would have to exceed $270. For permanent supportive housing projects or elderly or disabled heads of household, they will get a $400 deduction or an allowance, if you will. The worksheet is auto-populated with this $400 in here. If you're a rapid rehousing project and you're using this worksheet and your head of household does not have a disabling condition or they're not elderly as defined by HUD, and you can go look in the regs to see how they define that, or if you can't find it, let me know and I'll help you out. If the head of household is not disabled or elderly, then they do not get a $400 credit. So in my situation, I would not get this $400 credit. Right, so then it adjusts my income based on those expenses, right? Like the child care expenses, I had that, or dependent allowance, I had that $1,440. So the basis for my rent determination is going to be the $7,560. So here's where we get into the meat and potatoes of the calculator, right? The resident rent determination. So if the resident will pay rent and is not responsible for utilities or will not receive a utility reimbursement, they're going to be subject to that 30% of the monthly adjusted income, right? So that in my situation or in this example would be $189, or the higher of that 10% of monthly income. I mean, you would have to be taking an insane amount of deductions in order for someone's 10% of their gross income to equal more than 30% of their adjusted income. I've never seen a situation where that happens, but in theory it could. So that's just something else you would want to keep an eye on. So you'll go down a little bit further, and then to literally say in here in big bold, amount to be charged for the resident for rent. Boom. For participants residing in units in which utilities are not included in the rent, on line 37 of the calculator or 61 of the worksheet, I don't like the way it does that, but I haven't fixed it. Line 37 actually allows you to put in the utility allowance. So in the example that we used earlier, I think the utility allowance would have worked out to be like $27 or something like that. So you'll plug that number here, and it will automatically reduce the amount of rent I'm obligated to pay the landlord, so that I can use the remainder that I should have been paying up to 30% to pay towards utilities. If your participant has income, that is literally all you have to do. Now, let's change this example up just a little bit. Let's say that Jim is actually on 0 income and his annual income is literally 0, and he's a single person, so he has no dependent allowances. And you come down here, but he's still responsible for the utilities. This line 38 will return a negative dollar amount. Obviously, you cannot charge a participant a negative amount. But what you can do is you can give them a utility reimbursement equivalent to that difference, right? So it's essentially the utility allowance is going to have to be paid out to either the participant or the utility company if the participant has 0 income, but you still have to have a rent you still have to have something in writing that says how you came to that determination. I know it seems kind of silly, but that is the way it goes. So you can ignore essentially everything under supplemental information unless you're just really interested in like how all this breaks down. But that $324 is the amount of utility assistance that household is getting annually. So you can actually, if someone were motivated, they could figure out approximately what utility assistance is going to do to their project's rental assistance budget line on an annual basis for given unit sizes. And if there's a particular type of unit, when I say type, I mean like units that are only electricity or units that are only all bills paid or whatever, you can kind of figure out what that's going to do to your rental assistance budget line. And you can also figure out, right, by plugging in the contract rent for your, that doesn't work. Yeah, totally ignore line 42 and below. So, oops, let's not do that. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we'll go back to the PowerPoint. So we've got some questions here. So Amber says, what if they have lost their benefits and have not provided the documentation yet? Can I pay their rent, their full rent, or do I need to wait for the documentation? So, right, like you can, your policies and procedures would need to have some detail of what the process is for making exceptions to, Kim, I think I know what you're saying, but yeah, I'll get to that one in just a second. So you need to have something in your policies and procedures that says when you will make exceptions to participants that would be otherwise required to pay rent to the landlord, right? Like there's nothing in the rules or in the regs that say that you guys cannot waive rent for a month if there's like a hardship on the household or whatever. But you guys will need to, like, again, have something in your policies and procedures that says how you came to that decision, or when you will grant these. Like you can have, like, let's say someone's SSI benefits got suspended and they don't have any income for 3 months while they're getting that worked out with the administration. Like you guys can absolutely address that, and we would want you to, as opposed to that household getting evicted or getting, incurring fines and fees that are going to have to get paid somewhere. But you need to have something that says how you guys are doing that. Does that make sense, Amber? Okay. Right, like if all utilities are included, this is super simple and you guys don't even really have to worry about the utility reimbursements, obviously, because there's nothing to reimburse. But I know also that all bills paid units are becoming fewer and further between in the balance of state and in Texas and in the United States in general, I understand. So, you're going to have to familiarize yourself with how to pay these reimbursements because it's going to happen. So Kim is saying if they're paying the utilities, not if the utilities are paid by another source, correct? So, and I know that you guys in particular are doing it of way. Let's talk about that offline because I would need more information and we have 3 minutes left on this webinar. But I think I know where you're going with that, and I'm not sure I'm prepared to give you an answer on that. Okay, so paying the utility reimbursements, right? So if the project is determined that a participant is entitled to a reimbursement, there are two options for that household or for that project. You can pay the participant directly. That's what the notice says. The notice says that you guys can pay your participants directly an amount monthly equal to the utility reimbursement, or you can pay the utility company on behalf of the program participant. These are literally copy and pasted out of the notice, so you'll notice how much longer the paragraph is under the second option of paying the utility company directly. If you guys choose to do that, you can do that. However, you must have the permission of the program participant, and you must notify the program participant in writing of the amount paid to the utility company to allow the program participant to pay any outstanding amounts. So what that's interpreted to mean is, right, like you're going to have one, written permission from the program participant to pay the utility company on their behalf, and two, you're going to have to provide them written receipts monthly that says how much you paid on their behalf in order for them to correct any outstanding amounts that exceeded their utility allowance. The other way that HUD is saying that you can do that is you can pay the program participant directly. I would emphasize again and again and again that this is the only time that I've ever heard of any COC program funds being allowed. Up until this notice came out, you were not allowed to give any cash payments directly to program participants, period. Like, you couldn't do it. Like, you could buy them food or whatever, depending on your project type and what you were eligible to spend money on, but you could not give cash payments directly to program participants. So the notice doesn't really expand on what you would need to do for method 1. If participants are unwilling to sign a written consent for you to pay the utility company on their behalf, and you are paying participants directly, I would highly encourage you guys to develop some type of tracking system, right? So like written, like a receipt where they acknowledge that they received their utility assistance for the month and that they acknowledge that they're going to use it for utilities, et cetera, et cetera. Right? Like, it is what it is. This is written by folks up in Washington, D.C. that maybe don't have the on-the-ground experience that we do. I don't think that anyone is really super excited about paying those reimbursements directly to the participant because there's a lot of concern there. But right, we don't know what's going to happen. So the rule says, and I think is wise, right? Like, if we are supposed to be guiding people to the maximum level of independence, there's no reason that they can't pay their own utilities. Now, that said, there are records that should be maintained in each program participant's file, regardless of how you guys pay that utility assistance, right? So one is the annual income calculation that's set forth in the interim rule, and we went over that today. The other is the amount of the participant's rent portion, or the rent contribution. That's on the actual income calculation, right? Where a utility reimbursement is due to the program participant, evidence that the utility reimbursement was paid in accordance with Section D of the notice, which is essentially, right, like that tracking sheet. Again, it doesn't say exactly what they want you to do, except for provide them with evidence that you paid that reimbursement to the participant. Again, I would highly encourage some type of tracking. And then when the utility reimbursements are paid directly to the utility company, you're going to have to maintain written permission of the program participants' consent to pay the utility company directly. I know that's a lot of information, and it is what it is. For the project, you should be maintaining also, right, like your utility schedule that you use to determine the reasonable monthly utility consumption amount, and the occupancy charge policy, right? Like, is a charge if you're a leasing project, is a charge imposed? If yes, what percent? And then are there exceptions? Right? Like, anyone, rental assistance projects can make exceptions to the payments to the landlord. Generally, what we see happen though with rental assistance projects, because the rental assistance project makes a payment and the participant makes a payment, by the time the project figures out that the participant hasn't made their payment, it's already late, right? Like, the payment's already late and there's late fees that are being incurred. You cannot pay late fees, but that's a topic of another webinar. I know that I feel like I just kind of zipped through this last rent calculation part. I would encourage you guys to watch this webinar again, because you will invariably have questions as you move forward. But does anyone have questions right now? So if there are no questions right now, and you can continue to type your questions, I'm going to put up a poll that I'd like for you guys to work on. And actually, now that I think about it, I don't know that you can type in your questions right now. So there's 4 questions up here on the screen. Take a second and work through those four questions. Whoever was typing in the chat box, there's a chat box available to you now. And we'll just take a couple of minutes. It's 12:04. I want to be, mindful of y'all's time, right? Like, if you have to go, you have to go. But I can stay on for a little bit longer and answer questions if folks have them. Okay, so let's see here. Elena's got, for rent reasonableness, do you need documentation of how you determine the rent in each participant's file or just a record of it, since the rent amounts are not changing often? Do you need documentation of how, for rent reasonableness, do you need documentation of how you determine the rent in each participant's file or just a record of it? Right, so and each agency can actually maintain their own policy on how you guys are making rent reasonableness determinations. I would encourage you, right, like if you're part of a collaborative project like the one in Texarkana, that should be made in conjunction with your partners there. But, right, like you could say, for example, that units that were within like $25 of the most recent rent amount, you could, determine that they were reasonable without an additional market comparison. I think the thing is, right, like in the file, HUD's going to want to see what you use to make that determination. So you'll need to maintain that checklist that we had, right? The rent reasonableness checklist, and then the printouts. However, right, like if someone's going on to, like if they've been in your project, okay, let me stop. Let's say someone enrolls into your project, you're helping them find housing, you complete a rent reasonableness determination for a proposed unit, everything works, it passes habitability, lead-based paint, it's reasonable, everything's working out fine. You move them into that unit, you will need to maintain evidence of that rent reasonableness determination, right? If at the end of that first year and they go to sign another lease, if they're still in your project, you will need to do another rent reasonableness determination. However, there is nothing in the regulations that says that you have to do another market study if the rent hasn't changed. But you will need to have the basis for that determination ironed out. So if you're questioned on it, or if, God forbid, Elena leaves Mission Texarkana, that the next person will know what you did and not and be able to explain that to a HUD rep. So it's super important to have those rent reasonableness determination policies spelled out in your policy and procedure manual. Like, in fact, if you go back and read the rent reasonableness and FMR in the CoC guide that I posted, it's actually in the file. We can add another file box down here too, so you guys can see it from here. If folks are still working on the questions, which it looks like most people have stopped. But you'll notice where is that at? CoC, I think it's this CoC rent reasonableness document. Let me just make sure that's the right one. Yeah, so the CoC rent reasonableness one, the fourth one down there, has really good guidance for creation of a rent reasonableness determination policy. And in fact, right, like you can even say that if the rent was within a certain dollar amount that a person would consider reasonable, I guess it sounds weird, a reasonable person would consider reasonable, then you can write that into your policy and procedure. In fact, THN's got sample policies and procedures that we're still working on vetting that will have a rent reasonableness policy. But right, like if you are monitored tomorrow, HUD would want to see that determination. Now, the question that I'm seeing now that says if there are two participants who are renting from the same unit, can they use the same documentation to show that it is reasonable? Yes. The same backup need to be kept in each file? Yes. Or can we have a master copy of the documentation? No. You can have a master copy of that documentation, and I would encourage you to maintain like the PHAs are already doing this, right? Like PHAs have to determine reasonableness too. They can't just like say, oh, here, you can go use your voucher at this $2,000 a month apartment on the lake. Like they have to determine reasonableness as well. And so that document really lines out different ways to go about making that determination short of a market study. The market study is like the fallback. That's always going to work if you do a market study. And again, like HUD doesn't determine for you guys like what is like how far, like the apartments don't have to be within like a half mile of each other. Especially in some of those in the smaller towns like Mount Pleasant, right? Like from what I was looking at the other day, there's only like 3 or 4 available apartment complexes that are on apartments.com. So you can, if those apartments are a few miles apart, yeah, you can use those for multiple different units that you're determining the reasonability for, if that makes sense. But it's important to consider, right, like the type of unit that you're comparing. Like if you're comparing a multifamily, you should be comparing it against other multifamilies or apartments. If it's a single family home, you should be comparing it against other single family homes. If it's a duplex, and you get the drift, right? So it's just important that you're able to rationalize and justify what actions your project is taking that would be considered reasonable to the average person. But I would, yeah, Elena, if you have additional questions, I would highly encourage you to read that document. It's fascinating, and you may encounter something that I have not discussed on this call today that will really help you out. All right, I think that's it, guys. I'm not going to share with you the results because I'm just going to hold the poll results and maybe reach out to folks individually. But if there are no additional questions, we're way over time. I'm going to let you guys go. I appreciate you hanging in there with me. And if you are a rapid rehousing provider, we're going to do the follow-up to the landlord engagement webinar next week. I so very much appreciate you guys hanging in there and asking good questions. If there are questions after we get off of this webinar that you still have, please reach out to me, jim@thn.org, and we'll try to get you squared away. I know that this stuff, especially if you're a new project, it can be kind of complex. If you're an agency that hasn't received COC program funds before, like creating like all of the policy and stuff behind some of these things can be challenging. So that's something that I can help with. Yeah, and like Michelle said, thank you so much. Have a nice weekend, and to our folks on the coast, we're thinking about you guys, and hang in there. Thanks, everyone.